trade with simply money, is that people get paid off. A lot of the rallies that you may see in the cities there are simply paid rallies, and that carried over into the United States. There are actually more expatriates, Syrians, than there are in Syria because of this. And as a result, this culture of fear carries over into the behavior of Syrians in America and Europe and elsewhere, because if they speak out even in the West, their families will pay a price in Syria. And this is why you saw the State Department a few days ago call in Mr. Mustafa, the ambassador to Syria, and tell him that, are you taking pictures, etc. This may have been something new to some of you, but this is basically the modus operandi for the Syrian government, is that they keep monitor on Syrian communities in the West because they want to keep a tight hold on the families there. And I think ultimately, as we look at the context of what's going to cause Syria to change, I would tell you that I'm a bit more black and white about this, is that there is no way that this government can reform. They must go. And there is no way that the people in the streets are going to go back. You can't go back. When you live under a regime that eats its young, that will imprison anybody that speaks against it, you can't one day see you go on the streets and the next day turn around and say, well, okay, now I'm going to go back and see what the president will do, because you'll disappear, because the neighborhoods will change forever. And this is why they keep pushing forward. And I think ultimately there are many things we can do to push them and help them. I do think that we need to re-look at, it's interesting, many are surprised that with the change in administration that the positive poll numbers for America haven't improved. If anything, they've worsened, even though we're reportedly pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and this foreign intervention aspect is changing. And it has to do with the fact that there's still a perception that we cater to dictators, that we do not stand for anything that is clear. And I think this is an opportunity to do so, and that we need to, yesterday, not tomorrow, make it clear what the principles are that we stand for, that we stand with the Syrian people against oppression. When they see their government operate in a way that is inherently and intrinsically corrupt, dishonesty and lying is a way that the government operates there. So, we may hear something from the news agency or the Syrian president that they're going to change, but ultimately, this is just trying to buy themselves time so that the West gets out of their hair, and so that he fired the cabinet, and he's done other things that is typical. It's interesting. I think that if we are going to help, not only, I think, what's in American interests, but if we're going to rebuild American credibility, I think we need to stand for a principle, whether we know what's going to happen or not. It's sort of like when you're treating cancer as a physician. You can't treat it unless you have an idea of the status of the patient and the health of the patient, but also that you have a goal, which is health in mind. If it's just sort of making time, you might as well put your patient in hospice, unless you have a principle that you're pushing for. And I think ultimately it is important that we not always try to just pick the better of two evils. Nobody can guarantee you that the Brotherhood won't gain influence after this, if there is a change, or that other interests that are anti-Western may not rise. But I do think that if you're going to have an environment that will defeat ideas like the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists in the region, they've come out of this environment. The Brotherhood grew and flourished in Hama and other places because of the oppressive environment that has been the political winter, nuclear winter that has existed in Syria now for 40 years, if not more. And one of the things I wanted to do is, as I look back at my own family history, if you look at Syrian history, after the French mandate pulled out, you had President Kouatly that was in place for a while, and then you had Hosni Zaim, who was actually a dictator, and he was then ousted 2 years later, and you had Hashim al-Attasi. Now, Hashim al-Attasi was actually a Democrat who believed in a parliamentary form of government, was a friend of my family's, and put into place, women were voting, and you saw some reforms, true moderate democratic reforms happen. Well, he was then soon ousted, and Adem Shishakli came into power. Now, Shishakli was, again, pretty much a dictator, and you look at the history of Syria, you see this alternation, and we were talking about how many governments, 19 governments or so. Some were dictatorships, some were actually conservative and more democratic. But at the end of the day, that's an important thing for you to look at, because when we talk about what's happening in Syria now, the Ba'ath and the communists started consolidating power in the late 50s. And then ultimately when the Ba'ath came into power after they seceded back away from Egypt, and they came into power, that arrested any development politically in Syria. And they have been frozen in time. for 40 years. So what you're seeing now, that they've finally gotten the will to fight the government, they're not going to leave until it changes. But it's not going to necessarily be very pretty. And this is why calling it an Arab Spring is, I don't like the term spring, you have flowers blooming, etc. I think basically they're cleaning out the driveway from a winter. And they've been buried with snow, and now they're cleaning the driveway, and they're going to be able to start creating institutions. Now, either we live by principles and help them build democratic institutions philosophically, or we just step away and continue to do sort of like we did in the whole Cold War, which was to pick the best of two evils, and that is actually what lost us our credibility. And I think ultimately, as we look at tipping points, if you look at the history of these coups, most of them were bloodless coups until 63. And again, 63 actually, Hama was one of the tipping points. In 63 also, where there was a massacre there. And that was one of the that was a violent coup that happened. And the Ba'ath have consolidated power based on significant oppressive violence, and that's how they've stayed in power. And I think it's important that you will not see any type of metamorphosis in Syria towards moderation and towards modernism without a complete exit of the Ba'athist system. Now again, as Andrew said, we have some family now that I know that was in the military, and the military is also a jobs program. So it doesn't mean that you're part of the party in Syria if you're in the military. But at the end of the day, if you're a leadership in the party, you're a problem. And to say that somehow you can get rid of Esed, get rid of Rifat, or get rid of some of these family people and still have a workable system with the Ba'ath in place, it's not going to happen. That party needs to go. And for us to somehow think that we can listen to the words of some of the Ba'athists and they're going to produce what they say they are, there isn't one Syrian I've ever met that believes one word that comes out of Esed or anybody in his family or any of the leaders that are in the Ba'athist regime in Syria, because they just consider them to be completely corrupt. And at the end of the day, I think many Syrians now that we've broken this culture of fear, I cannot express to you how oppressive. I haven't actually, if you see all the public work that I've done, you'll find very little that I've spoken about Syria in the past 10 years. And that's because of my family. There's concerns that when you speak out that you'll have a family that will disappear in Syria. And I think now that what's happening is happening, we have to appreciate the courage that it's taken the people in Daraa, the people in Hama, the people in Homs. And Aleppo actually is starting, and if you'll see in Aleppo, they have the soldiers have gone in and raided universities to prevent anything from starting there, because if Aleppo and Damascus happen, it's going to be a tipping point. I would actually argue that economic sanctions would be very effective, much different than Iraq, because Iraq's economic sanctions were not necessarily effective because you didn't have an uprising happening. But what's happening is, I would tell you that Syrian families want economic sanctions, because right now they're actually yesterday were protesting on a work day, on Thursday. They're protesting on Fridays. They're protesting and they're making a lot less money, but they're helping each other out because they have to keep the protests going. And the only people that are making money are the government. And then and I read Osama Manajid's op-ed in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago where he said, well, it hurts the people if you do economic sanctions. That's just not true. You have to cut off the jugular supply of economic survival of the government. And right now, you can't even find a dollar bill in Syria, from what I hear, because they are holding on to money and they don't know what to do with it, because there's not too much trade and not too much business happening in Syria. So I don't think you can underestimate the effectiveness of economic sanctions and economic pressure. The energy pressure, I think, is very important. There are a lot of Western companies from Dutch companies, Italian companies, German companies that are still operating there. Apartheid went away in South Africa because many of those governments stopped working with South Africa. I think similarly, we need to put pressure on private companies to just cut and bail and get out of there and stop doing business with Syria. I think also diplomatic pressure needs to be put on. I mean, the fact that you've got diplomats still operating freely and doing their propaganda work in the United States that are Syrian diplomats of this thuggish regime, I don't think is right. I think we need to either kick them off our soil, which would be my choice, or at least restrict their operations to 50 miles within D.C. I mean, I wrote a piece about the Consul General in L.A., who's an American citizen, Shahabi, whose father was the chief of staff of the army in Syria, who was a big donor to UC Irvine, etc. And there have been protests from Syrians who are finally speaking out about his complicity with the Syrian regime, and yet there's very little being done to push transparency with some of the diplomats. I do think that I would want to remind you that the Syrian people are in the cradle of civilization, and it is a crossroads. I think that it's an American interest. If Syria changes, you could change the hegemony in the entire region. It's complicity with Iran, with Hezbollah, and other parts of the region would be extremely hampered. And I think there's nothing more in American interest than allowing a moderate change in Syria, and especially away from Bashar Assad. And for us to think that somehow him remaining, or any type of version or permutation of the Ba'ath remaining in power, is in our interest, I think is short-sighted, because that's not stability. The radical groups, Al-Qaeda that was pushed through Syria into Iraq, the Hezbollah army, etc., this has been done despite this era of stability that we have with Syria. It's not stable. It is a machine of radicalism. The tipping point is going to be either we're going to have somebody in the military, like the history in the 50s and 60s, that's going to come up and create a coup, or you're going to have a complete economic collapse in which you have millions in the street and the military won't be able to do anything. You'll have a complete takeover of the government. I think those are the two options. I don't see any other option. A quieting of the community, I don't think that's going to happen because they have nowhere to go. So either complete economic collapse, or there's going to be some military officers that take over and do a coup. My concern about that is don't believe everything you hear them tell you. We have to have people, UN monitors or other, on the ground to make sure that what we're told is actually what happens. And I wish my grandfather, Zudi Jasser, my grandfather, was alive to see what's happening, because as much of a disaster and a travesty of what you see happening, every Syrian I see thinks this is good. Yes, there's people losing their lives, but what's happening is a good thing. They have been living under the worst regimes. I mean, it's like Pol Pot and Hitler. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zedi. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the organizer for giving me an opportunity to speak to you. Obviously, I would like to thank Stephanie and Jessica as well. The two gentlemen over here, basically, they stole my speech pretty much. So now I'm going to have to start over. But anyway, the issues here really in Syria, I'm not going to dwell on what's going on, atrocity, because that's well documented. And I echo exactly what my friend over here, Dr. Zerdi, explained in a few minutes, that this regime in Syria is absolutely not a reformer. So let me explain to you who we represent. Obviously, I'm here to speak to you on behalf of Syrian people, Arabs, Kurds, Christian, Muslims, and other ethnic religious groups as well. Today, we see what's going on in Syria. Absolutely, it's something. I'm not sure, to describe how to describe it. It's really why we just so passive, not putting pressure on UN, on China, and Russia, and everybody who are opposing the UN through the UN mechanism. We need to do something about this regime, because this regime has killed many Syrians. Every single problem in the Middle East in supporting terrorism, terrorist organization, this regime supports. This regime is not a stability. Basically, the stability of the Middle East is, as what I heard from the State Department, we want a stable Middle East, we want a stable government in Syria. This is not a stability. This is not a peace. What this regime does is absolutely supporting terrorist organizations, such as Hezbollah in Iran and Lebanon, and obviously any other terrorist organization attacking American troops in Iraq in the last few years. And not only that, today is attacking and killing Syrian people. As we speak, the Syrian regime is killing. Obviously, this is the site of torturing, imprisoning. Now, you mentioned there's a frozen in time. I absolutely agree, frozen except in one area. They're advanced in torturing and killing and oppression. This is what they're doing. Everything else, they're frozen in time. And this is something not acceptable in this day and age. In the last 4 months, we have seen more than 1,900, almost 1,900 civilian people, unarmed civilian, were killed. This is, something that's impossible to imagine, that this is going on and nobody talks about this or does something about it. 600 soldiers were killed for refusing. From my own town, 33 people in Kamishli of Kurdish descent were killed for refusing to kill innocent civilians. More than 20,000 people are jailed. As a 30,000 people are displaced internally, externally, some to Turkey, some to Lebanon, some to Jordan. And this is, again, maybe even many more are displaced internally, but nobody had access to them. So this is a major event what's going on in Syria. Now we, as the Syrian Democracy Council, and obviously I represent organizations called Kurdistan National Assembly. We have been working on the Kurdish issues in Syria for many years because I want to give a little bit background on the Kurdish issues in Syria. Kurds comprise about 20% of Syrian population. The Mesopotamia region, between Euphrates and Tigris and north of Syria along the border with Turkey, this is a Kurdish region. Roughly 2.5 million Kurds live in the Kurdish region, about 2 million live in Aleppo and Damascus and elsewhere in Syria. So roughly you have almost 4 million, maybe more than 4 million people who do not exist in Syria. In 2003 or 2004, March 11, there were no Kurds, 0 Kurds in Syria. March 2004, there was a major uprising. Almost several million Kurds uprised against the regime. The regime killed 65 people, and hundreds were injured, and thousands were put to jail. To this day, some of them are still in jail. This regime, a few days later, they said, okay, we have Kurds, we're part of Syria, we're going to recognize and reform and give the Kurds their citizenship. There's 500,000 citizenship were taken away from Kurds, took their land away from them, and brought in Arabs into the Kurdish region and built settlement for them. So as a result, 45 settlements were built. 500,000 Kurds were illegal in the country. That means they cannot even check in on the hotel because they don't have no ID. They cannot get a driver license. They cannot go from city to city. They cannot get a job. They cannot get a passport. They cannot do anything. They cannot go even to a hospital, lousy hospital in Syria. This is what the life of the Syrian Kurds, in many, as my friend here, the Sunni majority Syrian as well are oppressed since Ba'ath took over. Now, we are here, obviously, we heard many things going on in Syria. Who can benefit, obviously, from regimes staying in power? Iran, Assad regime, ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Nobody else. Everybody else around the world, they see the right policy. It should support the Syrian people. We bring in new democracy, bring democracy to Syria, a new constitution for Syria to become a new society, a new country where all the ethnic and religious group in Syria will be part of an inclusive society. This is what we can make Syria to be. Become friends of the West, free market. We can make a peace with Israel. We can recognize the Iranian or Lebanese border. We can remove the threat of Iran. And by putting Iran's border today inside Lebanon, inside Syria, on the border with Israel, south of Israel, with Hamas area, pushing it back to the eastern side of Iraq. This is the only way to really stop Iranian influence by supporting democratic groups such as Syrian Democracy Council, Kurdistan National Assembly, and many Syrians who are alternative. What I have heard, many governments, including, unfortunately, State Department. The State Department here, I'm not too crazy about their thought process. Their thought process is, we need this regime to reform. And this regime, the stability is important. But let's analyze the background. From 60s, Assad